Hello everyone, today we talk in general about some topics that we'll have to discuss individually in detail, and that I realized that after all these videos we haven't quite discussed satisfactorily or even individually addressed at some point. That include fundamentally the formation of a U-bit power, the Third Crusade, and the decline of the Outremer states, their final end with the fall of Acre at the end of the 13th century. As you understand, they're very big topics, but I'll try to make a synthesis of the whole as an introductory perspective, and then we will move on at some point on each and every one of them. Actually, probably the most fitting video we made about this was the one on the Battle of Aten, right? And that was, however, just a tactical analysis aimed at explaining the course of the battle and describing the armies, their tactics, and so on. And that is, of course, of enormous significance for the history of the Outremer states. Arguably, it was the most important battle, or at least the one that somewhat catalyzed the greater process of removal of crusading presence in the Near East, with the ensuing fall of Jerusalem in October 1187, and that was of course connected with this enormous domination that had been extended through, in fact, the creation of a robust kingdom stretching from Egypt to Mesopotamia under the Ayyubids, which had been rendered possible by the political ability of Salah ad-Din, right, the Saladin of the Europeans, that determined, after this very serious crusading defeat at Aten, close to the lake of Gennesaret, the fall of the holy city of the hands of the Christians. Now, the Ayyubid power is it's fascinating in its nature because of the end of the Fatimid dynasty, its recompaction and extension under Saladin, right? And in order to understand the nature of such territorial domains, it's important to stress how these were connected to the political cohesion of the Egyptian rule of Saladin, right? That, the Nile Valley being essentially the core land from which the Ayyubids installed from the Middle East, and adding to this dominion in sequence basically all the Arabian Red Sea coast up to Yemen and Aden, so the control of the straits, and very importantly for Islamic rulers, the joint rule over Medina and Mecca. Right, there is a title that since Saladin, the Ayyubid rulers would have maintained on. Its power stretched over Cyrenaica, even on certain parts of the Libyan coast, including Tripoli. Then, of course, controlled the Jazira, the Syrian, the upper Mesopotamian and Syrian areas, the native Kurdish lands of the Ayyubids, part of Armenia at some point, and naturally with the conquest of Jerusalem, entire Palestine, albeit as we will see in Lebanon, etc., and except the coastal strip that would be secured by the Crusaders with the major third expedition in 1189. So, in order to control such an enormous territory, it's obvious that the means of the time were not enough to ensure a true stability and security, and it's very fascinating to study Saladin's life to properly realize the scale of the effort that ruler carried out to maintain things under control, right? Because we are in times when if you don't act, right, you're going to be taken down. If you do act, you risk being taken down at that point if you fail. And there is a broader expectation, especially in the Islamic world, of the action of the jihad against the infidels, the reconquest of the holy places, and in general, this confirmation, it has to pass through arms, of course, an effective rule, and that if you look even from the perspective of Saladin, and the Battle of Aten was was an enormous gamble, right? Aside from the strategic success that clamorously wiped out the kingdom of Jerusalem, and therefore, from that time on, would reduce the Latin presence in the Near East to a small thing fundamentally. Even immediately after the battle, aside from the Third Crusade, etc., it was evident that there wasn't much the Crusaders could do again to recover the whole area. This may be maybe a too peremptory judgment, because the Third Crusade was aimed to reconquer Jerusalem itself, and were actually two attempts that were aborted. Others believed, as would later happen in the 13th century, that the key to secure Palestine would have been to invade Egypt, to knock out the greater Islamic power in the area, and therefore and that's what Saint Louis would try. So yes, things could still be reversed, perhaps, but the blow inflicted by Hattin has to be understood also on a moral scale, that, as we know, as Clausewitzians, is the most difficult element to reverse. This, however, looks even more important when you realize how the capacity of keeping the Ayyubid domains together was, on the long run, unfeasible, or especially after the death of Saladin. The Ayyubids went on essentially up to 1248, when the Mamluks took over, when the Mongols basically also swarmed into Mesopotamia and Syria. So, a very different situation that is incomparable, but that immediately since the death of Saladin in 1193 showed, for example, the weakening on the control of Arabia. There are many interesting considerations to make also, probably on the strategical directions this took. For example, after the fall of Jerusalem, the Ayyubids wouldn't have much maritime interest at the standpoint of a maintenance of a naval force in the Mediterranean. Right, because still basically the Italians dominated around. The important thing for the Ayyubids was actually to secure the hinterland, the coastal areas, the branches of the Silk Road. Right, the Italians at the end of the day would trade, as they had always done centuries before the Crusades and centuries after the Crusades with his Muslim powers. He actually instead strengthened significantly naval force in the Red Sea. Right, since at least he managed to extend his control in Arabia through his brother, because of piracy that was quite active there, and that shows how important just the deterrent element is in all history, but in these times where territorial control was, in direct terms, almost impossible on a certain range, to properly keep all this thing together. And many other centrifugal forces existed, as you understand, around the same Syrians weren't quite happy with the situation. Later on, even the struggle with Frederick II and the Sixth Crusade, with the rivalry between Egypt and Syria would resume. There was always the threat of a rebellion or a rise, even within the same dynasty, and simply because different rulers are able to rule exclusively because of the support of local communities, right? There is no such thing historically like the evil guy that arrives and starts becoming the tyrant that oppresses everybody, right? Every ruler in history has governed because the majority of the moral force of the community was on his side, right? So this also completely takes out of the horizon any relativistic, hypocrisy about people not being evil but just fighting for their own land and other utter garbage. But the picture is of course characterized by an insane amount of violence, and the system is as unstable as frictional, we could say, and a lot of warfare, as you know, ensued. Also because at every success of a power, at every weakening on the other, there is always some sort of reaction, an intervention. When somebody becomes too powerful, normally there is a coalition to stem that, and whereas when somebody becomes too weak, there's somebody that is able to capitalize upon it and to interfere with it. Hattin was a massive defeat, right? As we were saying before, we analyzed the battle and we observed how, as most cases also in this kind of, what is a great defeat, right? The Crusader army hadn't been completely annihilated at all. But the Holy Cross and the King of Jerusalem had been taken. And that is, as a trophy, in the scale of moral impact, this has the effect of eventually the collapse, the evaporation of Jerusaleman rule in the region. This was the reason, of course, the Holy City falls, so a new crusade is announced in the West, right? And we will talk in detail about the expedition that was one of the best organized, but fundamentally fell short of expectations for many reasons. This went on for essentially between 1189 to 1192, right? New Crusader contingents arrived in the Near East. At this point, in a different way from the one that had happened in the past. In the First Crusade, it was fundamentally the papacy that had sent forces to the Near East, independently from what European monarchs actually could do at that point. So by the time of the Second Crusade, you see the effort of properly the European kings to retake control, right, on crusade from papal direction. But famously enough, the crusade mounted up by Henry VII of France and Conrad III of Germany fails clamorously. The shame of Damascus, so it was called. The Third Crusade was quite different, right? It had it was evidencing also in here the development, say 1 century of Western European development, in properly from a political and institutional point of view, organizationally, logistically. The West had, like the First Crusade proved, in an equally clamorous way, the incredible power, right, and moral and material capacity to wage war, right, from the heart of Europe, let's say, into places like Syria or Palestine that what do you think Godfrey of Bouillon even knew about? But that's yet another proof of how much we overlook, just ideally, without any touch with reality, the actual capabilities of humans. It wouldn't seem such even, let's say, an impossible feat, if anything, because they achieved that, of course, at the time. The capture of Jerusalem in 1099 had looked like a true miracle, because that campaign had been surely a pretty tough one, but here we looking at the thing from a concrete point of view. Of course, it had showed a Western military capacity that up to that point had been unprecedented, at least on that range, right, on that scale, and that vision, right, of properly of ecumenic scale of what the Christendom had to expand like, etc. This would have never been possible without the Gregorian reform, the papal monarchy, and what basically from Rome changed the whole history of mankind to this day in terms of what effectively the papacy became. That's the importance of the First Crusade mostly, because today the idea that the Crusades began with the First Crusade it's not even conceived anymore. We know that the same things had existed in Spain, in Italy. It's just that historiographically we're not used to think of that like in that way. We've made videos about that actually, but this broader expansional capacity had to find a discipline, an order, right? And this had been shown by the end of the 12th century. The Third Crusade does show such the consolidation of further Western military capacity, and not just towards the Islamic powers specifically, but towards the whole Europe, the whole Mediterranean, and beyond. Right, this is a phase of rampant growth of the West and of threat posed by it basically to any other area. right? Today we don't talk about, I don't know, the Reconquista or the Baltic Crusades, etc. But objectively, yes, the Near Eastern Crusades are the ones that best exemplify, in a sense, such potential, independently from the actual result that at the end of the day was a failure, and we'll try to explain also why this was the case. But it's properly the sheer amount of military force mobilized to go for it, when there was political motivation for it, because actually, and arguably, as we will see, the greatest problem for the continuation of the Latin rule in the Near East wasn't much of a structural problem or cultural one, as generally speaking, it's been said. There is a sense of defeatism in the West still because of the Crusade, in a way of saying, but they would have not worked anyway. I cited the thing for some year now, and I do believe that probably that it's so wrong under so many levels that it's difficult to even to address them properly. Not that there weren't problems in the administration of these countries, etc., but the question even there lays at the root. How much did the Westerners actually care about the Near East? What was that? How felt was the Crusade? It was, right? But one thing is feeling, one thing is acting, one thing is who decides, who controls, who has the greater interest at the end of the day. Sovereigns had. As for many things that, from it's a lesser perspective, hierarchically are not quite understood. It's like, the effort of Frederick Barbarossa in Italy, right? People say, at that point the Germans failed the possibility of creating a national monarchy and lost the empire and everything in a universal sense at the end of the day, because they had to instead of concentrating in Germany, they went in the Mediterranean, etc. Well, that is also kind of a 19th century nationalist ego. It has nothing to do, by any stretch of the imagination, with the actual reality of the 12th century Holy Roman Empire. So much that basically every single ruler, Hohenstaufen or Belfen, whatever, did the same exact thing. Guess why? Because these people knew much better their own world than we do. Right, about it, and there is naturally also an enormous set of evidence of why that was the case. Today we can't discuss that either, but it's a bit like answering for why would an English sovereign like Richard Lionheart or Philip II Augustus, later Louis IX, or again Edward I of England, or etc., the same Frederick Barbarossa at this point, or Frederick II, with all the problems that they had at home, right, would spend all that enormous amount of resources to go fight and die, even in the case of Barbarossa in the East, and risking what, cancel every classist interpretation of history for which, these were just a bunch of spoiled parasites that, terrorized their populations from the top of their wealth. These people were fully invested in first person with all the overwhelmingly crushing burden of responsibility to keep things together, and they perfectly knew that thing was necessary to achieve a moral superiority in front of the world, in front of God, in front of properly of their own right to rule, right? And that's why these sovereigns participate, and this is mostly evident. You see, Richard I, Philip Augustus, Frederick Barbarossa, right? Frederick Barbarossa, in this sense, he was the Holy Roman Emperor, and thus the supreme leader, right? He failed even to reach the Holy Land, right, as he accidentally died by drowning in a small river in Toledo in June 1190. And that is one of those things that do not go unnoticed in a broader universal perspective in at the end of the 12th century, right? Because that was a miserable end reserved for a powerful ruler, right? Frederick Barbarossa had been truly the most powerful individual in Western Europe in his days, right? Germany in the second half of the 12th century had properly almost managed to, it was still even under Henry VI, in the next years, capable of achieving defeat of reunion of the Western and Eastern Roman Empire and extending control over the whole Europe and the Mediterranean. It's not a fairy tale. As we were saying before, this was feasible, and the Crusade fit exactly this point. There would be many interesting anecdotes to tell in that regard, also about Frederick in his continental route that he took, the Danubian one, how he stamped, for example, he prevented successfully violences against the Jews as they had happened, as you know, in a disgustingly ferocious way in Germany at the time of the First Crusade. Outbreaks, and violence against Jews actually broke out in England at the time. How he was, all the relation with the Byzantines, even with other powers like Serbia, for example, in the area with Hungary, and all the problems that he, as much as actually think even about Richard Lionheart, that had his fleet shipwrecked, and the Byzantines stole his treasure, and wars, and opposed his crossing in Cyprus that was in fact conquered by him, as a very important strategical consequence for in the next centuries in the Mediterranean. But it was very difficult, as you understand. It was very complicated. Just as, think about the German crossing in Anatolia. The Sultanate of Iconium said, okay, yes, we'll give you free pass. And then what actually happens is that the German contingent is harassed throughout all the freaking way by hit-and-run Turkish attacks. That the Turks actually suffered. They have to evacuate their capital. There was even there, all a military picture that would deserve, in fact, a more in-depth video that we will surely make, because that's quite fascinating. But eventually he dies. Frederick dies. And indeed, he's not one powerful ruler. He's the powerful par excellence, right? He's the emperor of Germany who, with the defeat of the pagans, he should have carried out the eschatological mission of leading humanity to the heavenly Jerusalem after the return of Christ, right? And that is an idea today we can't, in my opinion, even picture anymore, right? Properly in the relevance, in the importance of the meaning of it all, and the fact that he died. Surely medievals were used as a bit everybody to failures, to shortcomings, to something that should have gone in one way of being prophesied, etc. But in a broader eschatological perspective, this failure, you see, Frederick was a very skilled ruler and commander. He would have surely achieved a lot in the Near East, right? If he had lived on. Well, this is exactly the point. What God wanted was something else, right, to happen. And the same fall of Jerusalem at that point had it look quite, bright 3 years before in the first place, right? So this added dramatically, in a sense, to the sense of confiscation of a broader, destiny to achieve for so many. Universalism was about to start dying in historical perspective, and even the death of such great sovereign, in a sense, is symbologically it wasn't read in a certain sense like that. The Third Crusade essentially failed to reoccupy terrestrial Jerusalem, to which Christians would still actually have free access guaranteed by an agreement between Richard I and Saladin in 1192. And Latin presence, however, was maintained exclusively along the coastal strip, right? And it would be the Italian merchants to keep essentially their fondaki and the commercial control of the Eastern Mediterranean through them. That actually reinforced after the Third Crusade. After that, the island of Cyprus had been stripped away from the Byzantines. that is a very important connection, because, as you know, the Lusignan essentially got the throne of the island. Richard Lionheart had conquered it, and this was a very important logistical base for the Italians to essentially access their Near Eastern port quarters, fundamentally, and to keep on making money, as they had always done through the whole freaking Crusades. And as you know, when the Crusades began in the Near East and they ended, the Italians had always been there from before and after, as we were saying before, and this would go on for a long time, at least until the Ottoman conquest. But that wasn't even, it was also a very different time for the broader decline of Mediterranean trade in general, with the discovery of the Americas, the circumnavigation of Africa. Here, in this perspective, it's as if not much had changed, right? There are very provocatory historiographical, perspectives on in fact, the uselessness of the Near Eastern Crusades. I have a different idea of this, definitely, and I will explain it better, but I already hinted at that before, right? Imagine, as we were saying before, a Frederick Barbarossa reconquering Jerusalem. Right, what would have happened to Ayyubid power at that point? Right, how would the situation? We can't really tell. Right, there's no way. It's not much a matter of saying what if. Right, there are certain events that are definitely much more cutting in a sense. I don't know. Think about the Norman conquest of England or the Arab siege of Constantinople in 718, that nobody hears much about, but it was probably the single most significant event for at least, especially the Eastern Mediterranean to Southeastern Europe, but in a broader sense, probably much more than others. Let's say the reconquest of Jerusalem by the Christians by the end of the 12th century would have surely changed a lot of things. It's not equally, there were too many things happening around to think that just taking Jerusalem would have been the deal there. But surely from a moral point of view, as we were saying before, the effect would have been probably devastating. It would have been in the Islamic world, at least in not much for the loss of the Holy City again into Christian hands, but specifically for a crisis in the idea of rule. And also the Westerners would have grown dramatically confident again. It would have probably went on to attack Egypt, as they would do also in the 13th century from a different standpoint. And probably there might have been some kind of Christian control of Mediterranean, right? It could have achieved in that way. We just don't know. And the reason why we don't know is that a bit the same that rules out the determinism about the fact that the Crusader states in the East had to end or to fail in the first place, because the reason why they did is connected to too much unpredictable factors in the broader, not around Jerusalem, but literally all over Eurasia, the Mediterranean, North Africa. And mostly they were of moral reason. The greatest problem of Crusader states was essentially shortage in manpower, because, surprise, surprise, Europeans at large didn't give a damn about that, right? They cared about salvation, would go there to fight for, I don't know, a few weeks, and then come back to Europe. And many other reasons, but still, there was a huge advantage, especially if you look at the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It's often overlooked in its strategical defenses. It was extremely well placed, was probably well secured from one side to sea, from the other the desert. It was a relatively fertile land, actually, right? It's not also an important one in that sense. There were ways to defend it, to secure it, to even expand further, right? And if one looks also at the relation, in fact, between Jerusalem, Egypt, other Crusader states, Syria, etc., realizes how things could go differently. We make videos about Crusader battles and so on. Just imagine all those battles if they had different, if just 2 or 3 had a different result, how different the world balance of the states would have been, and also how much it would have changed back in Europe or around there in the Near East, the Byzantine Empire, right, that we often also forget, right, the fall of Cyprus in Latin hands, for example, was a very important blow to the Byzantine Empire. And not only, we made recently some video about the Holy Roman Imperial ideology and what fundamentally the Germans were trying to do before Henry VI died, right, once he had secured the Kingdom of Sicily by marrying the last Hauteville heiress. And if he had not died, probably he would have launched a campaign that might have easily taken Constantinople, right, as would happen a few, like 6 years later with the Venetians and the French in 1204, right. There is in Byzantinistics also a huge debate on how and why, you know, what was wrong with the Byzantines, why did the system collapse so easily. Even in there was nothing deterministic. There was probably some kind of, on the longer run especially, of upper hand that the West was gaining under so many. The West had reached easily the Byzantine and Islamic East in a broader broader civilizational standards by the 12th century, right? But even what happened during the Fourth Crusade, it was, by the way, diverted expressly by the Byzantines to Constantinople itself themselves, right? So that's also another picture that people, you know, I know that there are a lot of legitimate, let's say, one thing is appreciating every kind of polity in history, as I do, because, as you know, we dedicate a lot of time to Byzantine history. One thing is just being a fanboy, right? And whining because in 1204 the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, just, you know, it's silly, right? Because if you know the context of it, I know it was a tragedy if you especially appreciate from an artistical, cultural point of view, so much was destroyed, etc. Yes, but we're also talking about that world. We're talking about 1204, and yes, the Byzantines had literally diverted the crusade to Constantinople for their personal dynastic schemes, and they're the primary reason why fundamentally the thing ended the way it did, right? It wasn't the evil Pope plotting against the fall of Constantinople, how the Westerners, these greedy barbarians. No, that's fundamentally vicious ideological, caricature that somewhat developed in some kind of internet subculture today, and that doesn't respond to the concrete advancements. There are still people today that believe, that the Renaissance happened because, there was Byzantine manuscripts fleeing toward the West. I met these people, right, that probably have zero understanding of what was by scale of difference, politically, socially, economically, technologically, in literature, in literacy, book productions, that literally believed that there was some kind of I presume they're the same ones that complain because the Romans conquered the Hellenistic city-states. Otherwise, we would have had the Industrial Revolution in the Iron Age. No, I'm sorry to spoil the thing, but that would have not happened. And you can't even say, now I'm digressing on that. I give you that, but it's a bit the same thing, right? The Byzantine Empire was not to fall in 1204 for an intrinsic weakness. It's just, and this you gotta give properly, right? By that time, the two civilizations were somewhat kind of equal in terms of, but surely there was some vulnerability in there, as for any other power at the time. And as I often, and I never stress it enough. I hope I was, picturing it decently for the Ayyubids before, that had also, they were in a sort of war situation for many reasons of political, say, Islamic political culture, properly the nature of the lands where the Byzantine Empire was more compact, but still any single power at this time was on the brink of collapse. It doesn't matter which it was, right? Any single power in in the world at the time could literally fall from a day to another because of a major, like, military escalation or something that was literally how fragile were the political and social structures at the time, right? And the Byzantines had never been particularly, as you know, in tune with the Latins throughout all the Crusader business. For them, they like the Byzantine culture properly didn't conceive the idea of crusade. Right, the only one that was launched by them was the one against the Bogomils. That those really are a pain in the ass, and you can fully understand the Byzantines why they did that. We talked about kind of Gnostic heresy on Schwerpunkt often if you go look in the history of medieval Christianity, you realize that all these heretics very far from being any kind of intellectual heroes of freedom, as the Enlightenment has hysterically tried to depict in an anti-clerical way, were actually probably the single most radical fringes of the entire medieval world, right? And they achieved some of the most ferocious and nonsensical, act. Of course, it's not even a matter of the ideology in itself. It's just we're riding the waves of some anti-civilizational movements that were bringing, not necessarily to a reverse in civilization, but to a chaos that surely would have not helped in the not just in the short run to securing what instead the other structures were trying to do. But the Byzantines never accepted the fact properly that a bishop could tell an emperor what to do, right, or even have the power to launch a military operation. So what they had asked the West in the form of essentially more Latin mercenaries, which were already spread all over the Middle East since centuries at that point, turning to that major military expedition, the Crusade of the Barons, that so neatly and orderly managed to, cross the wall freaking Europe and Near East and even take Jerusalem in one shot, right? And the Byzantines obviously had never given up the greatest ambition, of course, of reconquering Rome, still at that point, because up to the 12th century they still even had that ambition on Italy, but more pragmatically, concretely, the Near East, right? Not just because there were a lot of Christians there, and they had been intermittently able to extend their control in places like Antioch, etc., also these major centers, but properly because they were more akin areas from a cultural point of view. They were more easily reachable, and they would sensibly secure also the Anatolian frontier, the Armenian one, and recompact a lot of also of naval control in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it was simply, together with the Balkan and fencing off the Norman attacks from Sicily, essentially the most sensible thing to do. Actually, the greatest threat ever to the Byzantines had been the Normans, the Siculo-Normans, and/or because they were sometimes the same people, properly the Crusader expeditions that the Byzantines were quite helpful with the Crusaders when it took to make them pass in front of Constantinople, right? The quickest, the quicker the better, and it was a real problem because, of course, during the crossings, these initial crusades were mostly via land, then eventually would just go by ship. The third crusade would have been the watershed, but they crossed into Byzantine territory, and this normally escalated, also militarily speaking, but minor but also not so minor incidents. So it was always this kind of hypocrisy of the two Roman emperors kind of backing each other, actually not even recognizing, at least especially the Constantinopolitan one, not recognizing the West even as Roman emperor, but factually being just to concurrence, right? And obviously the Byzantines always tried to capitalize on the Crusader accomplishments to secure areas for themselves, not giving them too much help when things were going too easy for them. of course, align themselves with the Muslims as much as the Crusades also allied themselves with Muslims, often to fight not just the Byzantines, but sometimes actually each other. And so the thing is enormously complicated, and just a single local, like circumscribed situation can render. We'll make videos about these balances, right? But literally, even just the appointment of one king rather than another to the throne of Jerusalem changed things, like as far as Europe as the Middle East. Everything was so unstable that properly it makes you understand how there is no such thing like things had to go that way, right? And to try to find like a forced explanation for it is not very historically convenient in the first place. But also we have to acknowledge, as we were saying before, the failure of the Ottoman states and essentially of the Catholic penetration outside Europe, because this was fundamentally it. Europe was expanding continentally, right? Christianization, the extension of writing, of a stable territorial control is all something pushing from the west to the east, right? And it was a long process, right? The Baltic Crusades had much more enduring results, of course, and they succeeded fundamentally. The same goes for the Reconquista. But that's Europe, right, at least, and it is against, especially in the case of the Baltic Crusades, against populations that do not quite have a real consistency, right? Even the Moors of Spain are Spanish people fundamentally, and the Iberian Peninsula is a very, we have this myth of the Reconquista as two diametrically opposed realities, but it actually was an internal thing to Spain itself, right, to the Iberian Peninsula itself. So we can, in that sense, we can even specifically talk of some, in that case it's more, you see, someone else that is in Europe and has to be expelled, right? And it's just the rulers, and the great fight stands on winning the communities over. We were discussing this in which also tells you that for a long time the same communities of Spain have been okay with Muslim rule. And that's all another thing that, I know there are people who follow these videos thinking that I am some sort of, I'm trying to make the praise of the glory of the romantic mythology of the Middle Ages. It's none of that, right? The historiography told us that's nonsense, right? That we had that it's not intelligently flattering to reason like that, and also that we know these things today, so there is no need to start coming back on the same falsehoods at the end of the day. And it's all simpler, right? Because it's simpler when you tell reality, when you don't have to make up so much to justify your narrative. But as we were saying, the failure of Europeans to consolidate the power overseas at this point is even more remarkable when you look at the vitality of the West at that point, right? As we were saying before, the West at this point had actually reached and was surpassing in everything, right? If you look at the trade balance, look at technology, look at the spread of literacy, of properly even the sheer economical demographic growth, it's surpassing the Byzantine world, it's surpassing the Islamic world, right? It's not such neatly measurable, dynamic phenomenon, but it is concretely a matter of look how more consistent even just certain territorial powers were in Europe, right? As we were saying before, a Ayyubid power would be so floating compared to what you see. Germany was hyper fragmented, for example, but it kind of remained Germany. The same goes with France. There were still major chunks to consolidate here and there, but those chunks would remain those chunks and fit into a broader domain that would consolidate. The same goes for England. The same goes for Spain, for the Italian city-states. You see, there is no major floating instability that prevents that phenomenon of further consolidation to happen. In many areas that we can extend even to the Balkans, right? The same Fourth Crusade changed, we were talking about it the other day, an enormous amount of stuff in terms properly of local capacity to construct something more secure. It was a consequence, in a sense, of what had existed before, right? That old centralized satellistic system that the Roman Empire had maintained under Byzantine times had not helped to favor, let's say, the consolidation of a local capacity to structure further a local government in a long-lasting way, right? Paradoxically, Western feudalism, in all its apparent decentralization, was a much stronger gluing factor, right? And that's what we're talking about, feudal Europe here, managing to achieve that thing. But entire areas when, it's a huge system collapses, and it's filled with martyrs, with mobsters, with peoples that come from outer places and swarm into it and raid and pillage. And this did bring historically to a completely different story in the Balkans in that case. And the same rise of the Ottomans later on would be, in a sense, a proof of this. Again, so the West is really something else. And these centuries, the 12th, the 13th, even the ones before, of course, in broader perspective, you can't find that. They are a crucial moment of definition of Western civilization, and especially of these enormous medieval civilization that we actually don't know much about, because it collapsed in the mid-14th century, and of course it lived on, but before we didn't have the same measures of data recording, of documentation, etc. So this war between the 12th and the 13th, it's something that we understand demographically, economically, was enormous, was something incredible. Like, Europe fundamentally wouldn't reach the same level of it until the modern age, the 16th, the 17th century. And it was, enormous. And it was expanding at this point and creating some dynamics that fundamentally would define also the rest of European history, in ways that are often overlooked, because what we can't see often says, okay, it's as if it wasn't there, but it was there, right? And we just haven't fixed it, definitely. So, why did the Crusades fail, right? You see, from one side we have, of course, from one side, the most evident thing is the failure of a consolidation, conceptually, before other factors we'll see also externally. There is apparently the idea that the Ottoman states were not as territorially rooted as the Western ones, and this is understandable. Essentially, this was a foreign rule on people that sometimes were properly of different religion and different costumes, of different language. This is not a few, right? Certain scholars, a bit for the same need of making sensationalism and fireworks, have talked about this is the first moment of European colonialism. No, this is not colonialism, okay? Colonialism is an intense exploitation in an imperialistic sense of certain local resources with a completely different power ratio. This is the installation of a domination fundamentally based on the same standards of political and social control of the previous ones. It's just that they were foreigners instead of local ones, right? And this went on surely with a reorganization of the local, a redistribution of wealth, the attempt to replicate essentially Western feudalism by a certain extent. We'll talk about this in a while. People say this thing didn't consolidate. Well, we'll talk about this again. It's possible that the local communities contributed in part to this instability,
but I think that's a bit overstated, because there is not like there are certain episodes of resistance against certain impositions, exactions, etc. But it's not. If you look at Europe, I mean, it's basically the same thing. There's not a major historiographical theme that deals with, I don't know, why the Near Easterns actually wanted to get rid of the Crusaders as soon as possible. There is no evidence of that, right? More or less, they fit in as they fit for previous dominations. They were also, at the same, unstable, right? Think about the Seljuk Turks. Those weren't more similar to the Near Eastern than the Western Europeans, right? They were Central Asians fundamentally. What did they have to do with the Near East, with Mediterranean people? Basically nothing. So no, I don't consider that as a big deal. The failure to expand as well. Well, in terms of land mass, manpower, etc. Well, expanding from ultramar states is not such a great, it's not such an easy thing to do, and yet a kingdom like the one of Jerusalem came to threaten in well-organized expeditions. Also, some, they invaded Egypt every once in a while. They raided into it. They caused some havoc, and they surely were able to exploit all the, the weaknesses at some point that were at least most evidently opening in those realities that were also very unstable, telling you the truth. Another factor which is kind of obvious is external resistance. Well, the pressure of the Islamic world, right? But the pressure of this world is to be understood also in different terms from the ones we usually think of it. First of all, the Islamic world had reached its apex in civilization between the 10th, essentially in the 11th century, right? With the, you see, when the Crusades started. Right, that's exactly why they started. The Seljuks had already declined, right? They were already fragmenting, and the Islamic world was changing deeply in many ways. There was also a much more multi-ethnic reality than Europe. Europe is much more compact. Essentially, you just have the Latins, the Germans, and the Slavs, right? And some other, smaller groups, but that's basically it, right? And they're also pretty similar to each other, and they they interacted for an extremely long time, under some broader dominations, and there is not such a thing like the Near East and Middle East, that it's like all dotted of different ethnicities, of creeds, of languages. It's a completely different situation. The Islamic world manages to threaten seriously the Crusader states on multiple occasions, yes, but in perspective this happens also on a provincial scale, and often with the same help of the Crusaders that were fighting each other, right? And it's the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 is actually the consequence of that dramatic Ayyubid political compaction that concentrated its efforts to wipe out in one shot, in one battle, that if a reverse in outcome would have done the same effect on the same Ayyubid power, right, to wipe out the kingdom of Jerusalem. If Saladin had been defeated there, the whole Ayyubid system would have gone in uprise. We can't say that it would have disappeared. Like certain regional powers like Egypt, Syria would have remained there. But the possibility of compacting that under a single rule, right, was the same reason why the campaign of Aten had been launched in the first place. That is, if Saladin had not done it, everybody would have said, you're not worth of serving God, right, and we overthrow you, right? That is, by the way, as we were saying before, something very different from the way the Westerners look at their idea of leadership, right? For a Christian king is something that has to stay there, and that the Latin Germanic world had consolidated in that way exactly because during early medieval times it was a big deal to even have such kind of a decent permanent structure, right? And so that there's all a positive bias towards rule, but that this has deeper roots since the time of Constantine. It's properly a different, simply a different, it's Christian, right? It properly the Bible attributes to, and the New Testament to the idea of kingship, an enormous role and importance and centrality. In Islam, it's completely different. Basically, earthly rulers are seen as usurpers of the equivalent of Rex is Malik, right? Which has a markedly negative bias because it's an usurper of God's power on Earth, right? And he's to be knocked out. And so it's very easy to reverse things, and that's partly to be seen in the rest of Islamic history in a way in the era, and that's part of the reason why certain powers also didn't take off as much as, for example, the West did at some level. It wasn't just a matter, of course, of religious background or political culture, but it was importantly connected in part to it. So this dramatic threat of the Islamic war doesn't seem to have been there. The major threat was Egypt, right, and on a more provincial scale, Syria. And the same Muslims notoriously didn't quite feel threatened more than much by the Crusaders themselves. The Mongols were the ones that blew their freaking mind and spread a trauma in Islam with the destruction of Baghdad. It's as if somebody had destroyed Rome and Christianity. Like it would have been single-handedly the greatest tragedy in the history of mankind. But it's exactly what the Muslims lived through this destruction of Baghdad, right? And it was literally razed to the ground. And the Mongols definitely were something in terms also of models of powers, etc. So the aftershocks of that also were quite heavy, and they contributed further to a sort of destabilization in a way. But they... the Westerners, this is the point, they didn't have to cope with a dramatic threat in the Near East itself, right? Actually, the greatest power that threatened the Crusader states was the Byzantine Empire, easily, right? It was a colossus, especially after in this period of Comnenian rule. There was the reconsolidation after Manzikert. They basically reconquered almost all Anatolia to the Turks, and they began to expand. We were making that video the other day on John II Comnenus, recently also about his son Emmanuel. They basically entered the same John Comnenus entered at the head of his army, threatening essentially to retake Constantinople, march on the city, and the king of Jerusalem didn't have anything to oppose to them. That is often overlooked as well, how much the Byzantines played also as a destabilizing factor in a sense, in a way, especially from the threats that could come from Anatolia. It was naturally important because it counterbalanced the Sultanate of Rome intervening in the Near East, but at the same time it was such a huge power that the same Crusaders were always they somewhat froze also in strategical initiative at some point, because the Byzantines they were just next door. They would always exploit that. The internal limits of Western society are more interesting in a sense, or at least the not properly even a limit in itself, because you can argue that is part of the reason why Western civilization went on in the way it did. But think about the universalistic designs of the papacy and the empire do not come to translate into solid political structures with a wide and unitary direction for concerning the Near East and the Near Eastern matters, right? You can argue, oh well, that's the reason why, the papacy in that sense had prevented the compaction of Germany and Italy under a single rule, and therefore, from there easily the emperor could have launched a Mediterranean policy, and as we have seen, also as close as it went, even by failing against the Lombard League, etc., to simply come close to conquer Jerusalem or Constantinople itself, right? So indeed the clash between papacy and empire was a great limit. I'm not confident enough to say that it would have been better or worse, because it's too big. Tendentially, I am pro-imperial. Like, if I have to see the logic behind properly, also from a modern day perspective, of course, it would have been better to consolidate a universal empire rather than with some kind of values, certain uniform structures, etc. But wasn't that the reason why the same Byzantines, for example, kind of sclerotized in the end, and didn't quite allow the local autonomies and dynamism that instead, I don't know, for example, the Italian city-states won on the battlefield, right, and brought to our Renaissance, to our modernity. That's a part of what the same goes for Germany. The same goes for you see, it's important. This even in Europe, you can easily see how, I don't know, the French or English or consolidation, for example, brought to a shrinking of local power. Like if you look at Britain, like pick England or France at the end of the Middle Ages. Basically, London is the only big city in England. In France, there are many other centers, but still, in the most feudalized areas, there isn't much more around, right? The modern state has swallowed a lot, has centralized a lot in the capital, whereas at the end of the Middle Ages, Germany and Italy were all fragmented, but fundamentally they had the greatest technological achievements. So, was it good or bad that the West didn't achieve the reconquest of Jerusalem in a permanent sense? It's very difficult to answer this question. Think about all the problems. There might have been a broader consolidation of the Mediterranean, stabilization of the Mediterranean, a broader, I don't know, we can't even predict that, as we were saying before. The same struggle between papacy and empire brought to things such as the development of Roman law, the revival and the re-elaboration of Roman law, canon law, or an enormous civilizational offspring. Right? And it's difficult. People today don't reason like this because they are mostly ethno-nationalistically obsessed with borders, with Bluetooth board, and with colors of flags, and they think that reality fits all these nonsensical fiction. But the reality being that the fluidity of Europe was in so many ways its strength. Right, Europe blossomed into so many different places and ways, and that's what we regard as Europeans as our unity in diversity. And this is two of a great topic to discuss, and maybe we'll comment on some aspects of it. But as you understand, I don't like what ifs because they are too they're based on nothing at the end of the day. There is, in this regard, in Europe, also another limit at the end of the day. This was feudal Europe, as we were saying, and a bit this could go also for still the contrast between papacy and empire, but it's for the existence of all the other centers of power because of reciprocal contrast, etc. I'd say Europe didn't have truly robust center of power that could autonomously maintain, spread, and affirm its own interests, right, without competition internally, externally, in the immediate surroundings, etc. Every kingdom here was essentially minding his own business, right? The Third Crusade, you see, is basically France, England, Germany in this concerted effort, but it had been a problem. I mean, Barbarossa had to convince Philip Augustus to stop the war with England. Also, the French monarch had to make peace with Lionheart, to take the cross, etc. It was you see, there was a unitary intent, but at the end of the day, there wasn't such a thing like a joint operation, right? Every leader, for example, was doing on its own. They quarreled, right? After the take of Acre, also it's famous, they quarreled between the Austrians, the English. That was at some point the French left. So that surely is a weakness, let's say, that, if anything, in terms of unity of command, brought to all these opportunities to be lost, right? We just have to see whether those opportunities would have led anywhere more productive that would happen non-teleologically later on. There is also another obvious dimension, that is the distance, like the non-territorial contiguity of the outre-mer areas. They were overseas, right? So you couldn't just hammer them, like you would do against the pagans in the Baltic or the Muslims in Spain, because they were just next door, right? You had always to find the money to organize these massive expeditions. You had to pay the Italians for the ships. You had, still it was a very risky business, right? As you know, the Lionheart was shipwrecked fundamentally. With some, he lost his treasures. He lost part of the. It was always a risk. Still, still actually at this point, sea travel would be more convenient to the land route, right? But this is exactly the point. It was still a great gamble in a way. Plus other problems. Think about the death of Louis IX in the 13th century in Tunis. Like that expedition, given the numbers put together by the French, by the English, by the Spanish, would have likely wiped out Egypt, and Jerusalem might have been retaken. That's another inconvenient, but it was yet another risk of the broader systemic instability of this world. There is the aforementioned alleged incapacity of the Latin occupants to think and organize the public system in different forms from the ones of the motherland. That is partly true, but in my opinion, dramatically overrated, right? And you see, there are not many ways to rule a territory in the 12th century, even if there are differences, and obviously, as in a foreign land exists, but that's not entirely it. If anything, it's about the broader, reasons that you give these people to fight for you, and they weren't maybe so bad. We also spoke of the troubled but not openly hostile relations with Constantinople. Well, this in the 12th century indeed are all the factors that brought to the failure of the crusade, right? The Crusaders would stay there for another century, but they were confined to the coasts, right? The Third Crusade had managed to retain Acre, Jaffa, Jaffa's port of Jerusalem. There was surely a sort of, after all, of success to that expedition. The same Saladin had to agree fundamentally. Eventually, he died afterwards. The Latin presence, as we know, actually remained just with Italian bases, as we were saying before, that kept maintaining, however, an important, let's say, a foothold of some sort, if anything, logistically speaking, for eventual operations again. There were some invasions of the Near East again, even smaller ones. There were lots of other crusades that we often have never even heard of, but these things happened, right? Because on that scale of instability, it was easy to do, in a sense, even in a very modest fashion. There were other Christian powers locally. Think about the Armenians of Cilicia. There were, at some point, there was a project with the same Mongols in the 13th century to fight jointly against Islam, right, from a Christian side. There was always an opportunity to do that. Eventually, the motive for doing it seemingly wasn't worth it, right? There was surely a great, as we were saying before, say, moral impact following the failure or the loss of the Ottoman states, and probably was realized that given the effort, probably the thing was not worth it, right? Probably this failure had I tend to rationalize history. It's not always a good thing, right? I understand that things go very disorderly, in a sense that, once again, there's no thing like a deterministic or teleological approach that can satisfactorily explain all this. But the point is that I think always we underestimate our let's say, the intelligence of people who lived at the time. That is to say, things like the Crusades do not happen from one day to another, as they literally happened in the East, at least in that way, starting from the first, because of some extemporary reason. Right, we tend to see the religious thing, these words all because of the justice, the idea. But the question is that this thing was to be done materially, and there were more than enough indicators in the West, coming from the Frankish mercenaries that fought there all the time, coming from the Italian merchants that traded there all the time, that those areas were penetrable. That they were worth being invested in with an invasion, with a control. The freaking Silk Road stopped there. So these were fairly rich, fertile areas. There was a lot to gain from them. Right? It's the same reason why the Romans invaded the Mediterranean first, because of course those were the most advanced areas, and so they were. Still at this time, in retrospect, or maybe at least considering Western European standards were mostly the same. So why not? You see, in a broader perspective, and they knew that they knew how to measure that. It's just they didn't write it. We don't know the decisional process. We don't know much about First Crusade. The Crusades are mostly a story that we've been told starting from the 13th century, about the 11th to 12th. We don't know who took how the decisions. We simply, the sources do not tell that. Historiographically, as a genre, there was no way of producing that information. And we have to think it was something much more concrete and properly, positively decided than we assume. And so I think it was the abandonment of the whole enterprise. I believe that. At some point there was, of course, because of other contingental factors, as we were saying before, Europeans were mostly preoccupied with what was happening in Europe, right? But that's exactly the point. There was a moment in which, if before they were open to it, and after they stopped, or at least they were still open, but in fact they simply didn't do it anymore, albeit always maintaining the idea they should have done it, because the idea of crusade didn't stop up to even the 17th century, even the 18th century in a sense. There must have been a connection, and aside from the hypocrisy, of course, the public dimension of the idea of that we see so much in the series we make on the 6th and the 17th century, that everybody in theory was bound to be a crusader, as a leader, as a king, whatever. But at the end of the day, there were other problems for which everybody knew that, okay, but maybe not now. So, yeah, well, whatever. We will keep talking about these things again. There is so much to tell, as you understand. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.